Everybody, we are in week 10, if you can believe it or not, and we are dealing with the second half of the 20th century. Last week we left off with the Second World War, which really changed the course of the world significantly through, experiences of loss of life, new political borders, new countries, okay? So we're starting again with another timeline here. All right, let's look at some things that have really impacted the world. All right, 1948, the creation of modern Israel. 49, the creation of the People's Republic of China was established. From 50 to 53, the Korean War. 58 to 61, the Great Leap Forward in China, which was really anything but. Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin Wall, Vatican II, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So you can see that just lots of stuff happened, though that was the tagline for last week, not this week. Okay, no, but seriously, once we get into the 60s, we really see, the influence of civil rights. All right, obviously here I've got Malcolm X assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated, the Vietnam War, Iranian Revolution, fall of Berlin Wall, Tiananmen Square, Gulf War, collapse of the Soviet Union, which I talked a little bit about earlier, the European Union open, and of course, once we get into the 21st century, we of course get like 9/11, the U.S. invades Iraq, the war on terror, which kind of went on and on and on and on. All right, so it gives you just sort of some big like political events that happened in the second half of the 20th century. All right, so let's go back kind of to about 1950. All right. The post-World War II era is often remembered as a time of peace and prosperity. Obviously, there are significant social injustices within the United States and, of course, globally, and I'll talk about that. I think it's going to be the next video. But it was a time of economic plenty for many people. There also seemed to be a real desire just for, like, life to be normal again in the shadow of, the Great Depression, World War II. All right. So, like, when you think of things like the music and the TV shows produced at the time, it's utterly shocking to compare that with what everybody had actually experienced over the previous decade. Okay, you see this desire to just sort of like return to normal after this huge disruptive event. The post-war years were a time of great civic and religious engagement. All right, this is the height of church attendance. Like, in the United States, like that is the peak of church attendance right there, the post-war years, okay? But it wasn't just church. People were joining clubs and leagues. They were just it was a country of joiners, all right? We aren't really a country of joiners anymore, unfortunately, but people were, joining, the Knights of Columbus and different clubs and bowling leagues and just all sorts of things, okay? All right, let's talk a little bit about 20th century revivals. Okay, we talked extensively about the first two awakenings, the first and the second Great Awakening. But America continues with this tradition of revival, well into the 19th, 20th century. So let me introduce you to a few really popular revivalists that bridge the gap between kind of the second Great Awakening and like Billy Graham, who I'll talk about in a second. First up, we have this individual here, Dwight Moody. He first worked revivals kind of during the Civil War with Union troops through the YMCA, which used to be the Young Men's Christian Association, and apparently now just is the Y, I recently learned. He established a church in Chicago, though he ends up being much better known as an evangelist. Okay, he founded the Moody Bible Institute in 1886. He promoted international missions, wrote books, etc., etc. He was really kind of like a down-to-earth revivalist. If you remember, this is kind of a common theme with some revivalists, like, being very relatable to the people. He wasn't highly educated like some were in previous revivals, but he had a really effective, energetic style. All right, and so he was a really influential revivalist. It kind of works as almost a little bit of a bridge figure to the more like 20th century revivalists, which bring me to McPherson and Sunday. Now, These two are real characters, okay? And they also really demonstrate the fusing of revivalism with the entertainment industry that you see in the 20th century, okay? So Billy Sunday, let's start with him. He was born in 1862 in Iowa. He came from a very poor family, but he was really, really, really good at baseball, okay? And he ended up playing professionally for the Chicago White Stockings, which is what the Chicago White Sox used to be called, among other teams, and he had an 8-year career. Now, somewhere around 1887, Sunday and his teammates were in Chicago and they were enjoying a day off when they heard a street preacher. Okay, this was apparently a very transformative event for him, and he ended up converting to Christianity. All right, he had never had like a particularly wild life before this, but he gave up drinking and gambling, and so he ends up marrying like an heiress. Okay, there's lots of money, who is a Presbyterian, so he becomes a Presbyterian. And he says, you know, whatever she was, he would have been. All right. He gave up baseball, which he was making quite a bit of money at, to join the local YMCA. He eventually became an assistant to a well-known evangelist at the time, and then in 1896 he struck out on his own, and he really fused his fame as a baseball player to generate interest in his revivals. And after years as a traveling evangelist, his wife Nell took over the administrative aspect of kind of his evangelistic campaigns and then totally transformed his ministry. By 1917, they had a staff of about 26. His preaching was like really energetic, and he'd like throw chairs and yell, and it was all quite dramatic, and people loved it, and they came and saw him. All right. Now, let's talk about this next figure. Here we have Amy Semple McPherson. So while Sunday used his fame as an athlete to really promote his revivals, Semple McPherson kind of fused her ministry with the glamour of Hollywood. In fact, I'll put up a little clip of her. She was a really interesting woman. She married a Pentecostal preacher really young. They became missionaries over in China. He died within like 2 years. She came back home. She was pregnant. She married again, divorced him, and became an evangelist, a revivalist. And instead of becoming a traveling evangelist, she moved to Los Angeles, which was really the center of Pentecostalism, and built this giant church, like a mega church, all right, the Temple Angelus. And her idea was that instead of her traveling everywhere, lots of tourists were coming to LA. They would come to her church so she could preach to them and they could bring the message to the world. Okay. She used media extensively. So she was before TV, but she was one of, sources vary, she was either the first or second woman to actually license her own radio station, and she had this whole radio ministry. So her later years, she's kind of plagued by scandal, but she was a really interesting revivalist. Okay. And then finally, we cannot talk about 20th century revivalism without talking about Billy Graham. Okay. He's the most widely known evangelist of the era. He was born in 1918 in South Carolina, and he died 100 years later in North Carolina. He was born and died in North Carolina. He's credited with preaching to more people than anyone else in history, just like period. Okay. Estimates are that he preached to about like 215 million people in person. And that is not including all the other mediums that he used, such as radio, television, books, etc., etc. He was really influenced by the revivalist preachers that came before him, and he was ordained by the Southern Baptists in 1939. He was already getting some national recognition as a revivalist preacher by the end of the 1940s. But it was in the post-war years that he really takes off, okay? He used radio and television to get his message across to as many people as could. And he's also really charismatic. So it's like a minute long of him preaching really, really early in his career, just so you can see kind of what he was like back in the day, all right? It's pretty interesting. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association did tons of ministries and outreach, including creating Christianity Today, which is obviously still in print, and they've got a host of other media platforms that they, podcast and different things. And he would hold these massive revivals, which he called crusades. Kind of an interesting choice of words. And this is actually really interesting. After 9/11, he stopped using the word crusade. Anyway, despite his incredible success, he wasn't without controversy. This may surprise you, but he was actually considered too liberal by a lot of folks in the Southern Baptist Conference, by other fundamentalists, okay? They accused him of like working with the godless mainline Christians, okay? Kind of, I always think that's sort of funny. He was caught on tape saying some anti-Semitic things in the 1970s, and he was also being accused of like being too simplistic in his message. That was Reinhold Niebuhr. He didn't like him, but he was also really influential. He met with like lots of presidents and other leaders. And I read this online, but he was rated one of the 10 most admired men in the world by Gallup 51 times. All right. Whether you like him or not, he was really, really popular. And you really can't talk about 20th century Christianity without talking about Graham. All right. And what I think is important to understand about Graham is his own views on evangelism. For him, the evangelist is not primarily a theologian or a social reformer, though they may do those things. Their task is very much aimed at moving the spiritual to a more prominent place in society. Okay. It is calling people to a greater life of holiness, a greater commitment to Christ. And actually, Graham was fairly committed to bettering society. He integrated his crusades real early, got a ton of flack from Southerners for that. He was a really close friend with Martin Luther King Jr., often inviting King on his crusades. And here's kind of an odd quirk of history. It was apparently Graham who bailed King out of jail in Birmingham, the place where he wrote that letter that I've posted on the Moodle page as well. One more kind of interesting fact about Graham. He was so well known that you could actually address a letter to Billy Graham, St. Paul, Minnesota, and it would get to him like he was Santa or something. Okay. One thing when I sort of wrap up the talk of wrap up evangelism, revivalism, I always ask the question, like, is the era of revival over? Are we ever going to get a figure like somebody like Graham again, or McPherson, or Finney, or Palmer? Like, are we going to get a figure like that again? It's a great conversation piece, but since we're online, I'm just going to throw that question out for you to think about. We have a long history of it in the United States, but I mean, the world is a different place. So I don't know. All right. Okay. I'm going to wrap up this video and we will talk a little bit about civil rights in the next one. Thanks, everybody.